Well, to set the scene more seriously for what we're going to talk about tonight, this whole topic of can life have meaning without God, let me kind of set the scene with a story. A year or so ago, a friend of mine, I was flying from Toronto to Vancouver, and having considerably more money than I do, she was flying business class. And so whenever I fly with Air Canada, they don't even put me in economy, they put me in the luggage rack at the back because I'm small and fold up nicely. But she's wealthy, so she was flying business class. And she found herself seated on the plane next to a former Canadian hockey legend, the kind of person, if you were to mention this person's name anywhere in Canada, actually possibly even in the US, he would be well known. And, but it turns out this former sports star was a nervous flyer. So before the plane had taken off, he was knocking back whiskies in the lounge, and then the kind of fear of flying and the alcohol loosened his tongue, and so as the plane taxied out for takeoff and roared down the runway, he began talking not so much to my friend as at my friend. And for about 45 minutes he talked without stopping. He talked about his career as a sports star, he talked about the businesses he'd launched since being a professional hockey player, his family, the multiple houses he owned, on and on and on he went. Finally, after about 45 minutes, he paused for breath. And so my friend took the opportunity to insert herself kind of into the conversation. And she looked at the gentleman and she said, "What an incredible life you've had, an amazing life you've had. You must be incredibly happy. What a life you've had." She said it was fascinating because instantly the gentleman's whole demeanour changed. He kind of looked at the floor, he kind of shuffled his feet, and in fact tears came into his eyes. And he said, No, I'm not. I'm as miserable as hell. I'm as miserable as hell. And so she began to ask why and kind of dig into his story a little bit. And basically what happened is it turned out that his kind of career as a hockey player and in business and all of this stuff had him in its own shadow. He'd kind of risen so high and had become so successful that he was very, very aware, painfully aware, that the only way was down. And that whole story, I think, for me, raises a fascinating question that we're standing on the edge of this evening with this whole topic. You know, what do you do when you've reached the pinnacle? What do you do when you've achieved everything you've hoped for, whether it's in business or on the sports field or whatever it is you're aiming for in life? If you've got there, you're at the top of the roller coaster, and then you're about to come plunging down into decrepitude. How do you face that? And that explains why this whole question of life's meaning really matters. Because it is at times like that when you have to really wrestle about why you're here on planet Earth, whether your life really has any point, if your existence has any point, that this question becomes really important. And so this whole question of the meaning of life is a fascinating one. In fact, there was a recent poll for an internet search company. It was probably Google. They own everything on the internet, including all of our personal data, don't they? There was a poll carried out for, I think it was Google, a year or so ago, and it asked people this question: what is the most difficult question of all? What's the most difficult question on the planet? And it's interesting that this question we're looking at tonight came number one on the list. What is the meaning of life? That came far above other, existential stumpers, such as what is love? Do blondes have more fun? When will the Brits win in any international sporting events? All of those kind of questions were paled into insignificance beside this question: what is the meaning of life? Now, what's interesting is when I talk about this on university campuses, where I often give the talk that I'm giving tonight, I usually get at least one or two people in the audience, looking either a little bit skeptical or even sort of heckling and interrupting, and say, the whole question of the meaning of life, that's maybe a question that bothers philosophers, but I can get through life without worrying about it. I don't have to deal with the question of the meaning of life. It doesn't really matter. I'm just an ordinary person. And if that describes you this evening, if you're sitting there thinking, why all this fuss about the meaning of life? Does it really matter? I think actually it does. And I think we all instinctively know it really matters. And I can show that actually with a simple thought experiment. Imagine that while I'm up here talking at you, what passes for an intelligent British accent. I saw who laughed just then. Your cell phone was to vibrate in your pocket. And you pull your cell phone out of your pocket to see a message from your best friend. And it says, cancel everything. Cancel everything. Meet me tomorrow at Starbucks at 9 a.m. Now, what would you do? What would you type back? Aside from Starbucks, are you joking? Do you think I'm made of money? What would you text back? I imagine instantly, however good your friendship, you would text back the question, why? You'd ask them why. Why do you want me to give up everything I'm doing already planned tomorrow morning and come and meet you at Starbucks for an hour? Give me some more information. In other words, you would ask your friend to justify 1 hour of your time. You would ask them to justify that 1 hour of your time. Well, here's the interesting question. We instantly, without thinking about it, would ask a friend or a colleague sending us a message like that to justify 1 hour of our time. Many of us as human beings, though, can't justify our entire existence. If someone was to ask us, well, okay, what are we here for? People would give us a blank look. And you see, your answer to the question, what is the meaning of life, is vital. It's an absolutely vital question to address, because your answer to that question, what is the meaning of life, will affect lots of other things. It will affect your politics. It will affect your values. It will affect how you spend your money. It will affect the sticker that you slap on the fender of your Toyota. All of those things will be affected by your answer to this question. And more importantly, when tragedy or suffering or adversity strikes you, as it will, because it strikes every single one of us at some point in life, your answer to the question, what is the meaning of life, what is the purpose of your life, will help determine whether you successfully ride through that tragedy or whether it destroys you in the process. The famous atheist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, possessor arguably of the most impressive moustache in the history of philosophy, said this. He said, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. In other words, if you have a meaning to life, if you know why you are here, then even if life gets really, really, really tough, you can see it through because you know what you're living for. Now, Nietzsche was, of course, an atheist. And in fact, it was he who popularized the slogan, "God is dead." And now that raises the question whether you can actually have a why to live for, whether you can have a meaning to live for if God does not exist. That's the question I want to explore this evening. Now, the interesting thing, even asking this question on some university campuses, for instance, can get you in trouble. I was speaking at a university in Vancouver just about a week ago, and on the Facebook page for the event, an enthusiastic young skeptic at the university had accused us of being bigotry and hateful for even suggesting that this might be a debate. You know, how on earth could we even ask the question, can life have meaning without God? And actually what I pointed out to him, I said, it's interesting that you find the question offensive, because an older generation of atheists would have no problem admitting that if there is no God, life can have no meaning. There are atheists who admit this. One of the most famous atheists, in fact, of the 20th century is the gentleman on the screen behind me, Bertrand Russell, very famous British atheist. Many of the greatest atheists in recent years have been British. We specialise in the UK in exporting two things to the world, financial chaos and atheism. Bertrand Russell, one of the world's leading atheists. And he would say, no, you can't have meaning unless there's God. Let me read you a short extract from one of his most famous essays where he makes this point. It's quite wordy, so I apologise for the sort of slightly flowery turn of the century language. But his words, as you reflect on them, pull no punches. No God, no meaning. Let me read you what he says. He says, man is the product of causes which had no provision of the ends that they were achieving. His origin, his growth, his hopes and his fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. No fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. All the labours of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. And the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Cheerful stuff. What he's basically saying in simple contemporary language is the problem is this: you will rot, your descendants will rot, one day the human race will die out, one day the sun will expand and swallow the earth, one day the universe itself will come to an end, empty and dark and cold and alone, just like Oklahoma. And they don't laugh so loudly there, they throw things. And so given that outcome, the only conclusion, says Dr. Russell, is despair. It's the only logical conclusion. But, look on the bright side. At least we can be certain about despair, and we can build on that. Now, I disagree with his conclusion, but I hope many of us would admire his courage this evening, because he's willing to admit that's where atheism leads. It leads inevitably to despair, and what you have to do is kind of grin and bear it. He was aware of the price that atheism cost, in other words. By contrast, many contemporary atheists that I come across are not so willing to pay the price of atheism. They're more content to try and sort of peddle a slightly low-budget version of atheism. So, for example, here is the American atheist, Moline Matsumura, writing much more recently than Bertrand Russell, and she says this. She says, "We humanists agree that there is no karmic law, no grand plan, and no grand planner to make the world make sense for us. Instead of discovering the meaning of life, we are faced with creating meaningful lives for ourselves." Last year I did a debate at a major Canadian university with a very well-known, at least in Canada, atheist philosopher up there. And it was interesting, to a packed lecture hall of about 500 people. That was his thesis for the entire evening. He was basically, there is no meaning built into the universe, we're all going to die, we're all going to rot. Bertrand Russell was basically right, but hey, cheer up, we can do what we like and we can invent our own meaning. We can invent our own meaning, even though the universe looks pretty bleak. Now, this idea that we can invent our own meaning, I hear all over the place. I hear it from many contemporary atheists, I hear it from skeptical students, I hear it from numerous people who tell me that we don't need God to give us meaning, we can invent our own meaning. So I want to sort of press on into the topic this evening by showing you 3 reasons why that doesn't work. There are 3 reasons why simply trying to invent your own meaning to life, as some would tell us we can do, doesn't work. And then we'll dig in a little bit further to why this really doesn't work if there is no God, and then we'll end the evening by showing perhaps the Christian perspective on some of this by way of counterpoint. But 3 reasons, 3 problems with the idea that we can create our own meaning. Here's the first one. The first problem with trying to create our own meaning, with perhaps whipping up a little purpose to life as if we were inventing a novel variety of souffle, is that it assumes the universe cares. It assumes the universe cares. I mean, think about this for a moment. Imagine that the universe is all that there exists, all that exists. There is no God. So just to think about that universe for a moment. Think about it with awe and wonder. 13.8 billion years old. As ancient as time itself. Over 92 billion light years from one side to the other, containing stars and supernova and gas clouds and various exciting things, too numerous to count. Awesome and majestic and incredibly near infinitely big. And before that universe, the human being purports to stand and say, well, I don't care how big you are, my friend, I've invented a little meaning, you need to take it seriously. The universe, quite simply, laughs in our face. In fact, the poet Stephen Crane, I think poignantly sort of summed up the lunacy of claiming we can invent our own meaning in the face of an atheist universe when he wrote this poem. He said, "A man said to the universe, 'Sir, I exist.' However," replied the universe, "that fact has not created in me a sense of obligation." In other words, why should we assume the universe owes us anything? Why, you can make as many eloquent pronouncements as you like as an atheist. You can dance around and make as many pronouncements you like about the meaning to life you have invented, but it's only a matter of time before you fall foul of the next virulent virus, falling rock, or any of the other multifarious ways the universe reserves for the dispatching of small, squishy, carbon-based life forms. In other words, it doesn't make a difference. Problem number 1. Second problem is even more profound. Second problem with the idea that you can create your own meaning. What happens when those meanings clash? What happens when the meaning to life that you've invented and the meaning to life that I have invented clash profoundly? How do you resolve the problem? Let me illustrate for a moment. Let's imagine that one of you here this evening decides that you are going to find the meaning of your life in embracing the cause of environmentalism. Embracing environmentalism. So, for example, you buy only locally sourced food. You cover the roof of your house in solar panels and install a windmill in the garden. You plant a tree for every puff of carbon dioxide that you guiltily emit, and you even drive a clockwork Toyota Prius. You are as green as it can possibly be. You are utterly committed to your cause. Wonderful. Well, here's the problem. I, on the other hand, have picked a very different meaning to life. I hate to disappoint you this evening. I have decided my meaning of life is going to be to have a carbon footprint bigger than that of Sasquatch. So I install a vast coal-fired turbine in my garden shed. I have my morning coffee flown in by 747 jumbo jet from Peru every morning. I invest in strip mining and clear-cutting operations in the Amazon, and to cap it all, I drive not one but two Hummers. So who wins? My meaning to life and your meaning to life are utterly different. They clash entirely. How do we resolve them? Who wins? Well, given that if atheism is true, there is no meaning built into the universe. We can't sort of appeal upwards to God or anything to arbitrate between us. So I guess the only way we can resolve the difference between my meaning to life and your meaning to life is we have to fight it out and see who wins. Although I tell you, I will take my gas-powered lightsaber over your wind-up clockwork potato peeler any day of the week. That's the second problem. Third problem. I said there were three. Third problem with the idea that you can invent your own meaning of life gets to the whole heart of what we mean when we talk about meaning. Because I think when atheist friends tell me that they can have meaning to life without God, they are using the term meaning with every due respect in a somewhat slippery way. See, what do we mean when we talk about meaning? Well, let's illustrate by, by taking one of the most popular atheist books of the last 10 years or so. This is written by a gentleman called Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. Some of you may have heard of the book, maybe even one or two of you have read it or have seen him on chat shows or TV or YouTube or whatever. His book here sold 6.5 million copies. And he's one of a whole sort of a panoply of celebrity atheists who have really taken the world by storm in the last 10 years. But Richard's book, The God Delusion, really kicked the whole thing off. But let's suppose we engage in a thought experiment this evening. What's that book actually about? What's the meaning of Richard's book, the God Delusion? Well, suppose I were to read his book, and I decide for myself that the meaning of the God Delusion is actually, it's a cookery book. It's actually nothing to do with atheism. It's a cookery book at heart. And I'm inspired by what Richard Dawkins writes to invent a cornucopia of cakes and desserts and trifles and whole wonderful sticky things. And I find cookery to be the meaning in the book. That's the meaning that works for me. You, on the other hand, you open up the God Delusion and you conclude that it's actually a book of taxidermy. It inspires you to take up stuffing small animals with sand. It becomes a whole new hobby for you, and soon your shelves in your house are, graced with everything from mice to mink, rats to rabbits, each gazing down at you through glass eyes and rictus grins. Now, in due course, we bump into each other in the local coffee shop, and we start an argument, actually. We have an argument about the book. We argue over who's right. So it's a cookery book, I say. Get stuffed, it's about taxidermy, you say. Thank you, one person who got that joke. And mid-argument, who should walk in the door of the coffee house but Richard Dawkins himself, who happens to be visiting Atlanta? And he sees the two of us rolling around the floor, engaged in a fight, and he says, what are you two idiots fighting about? And we tell him, we're arguing about the meaning of this book. And then he pipes up and says, well, let me solve it for you. I am the author. Now, if that's true and he is the author, presumably that gives Richard the right to say what the meaning of the book is. Occasional postmodern protests to the contrary, there is such a thing as authorial intent. When writers write books, they generally put a meaning into them. Now, on the other hand, if the book, The God Delusion, had no author, if it was the result of an explosion in the Scrabble factory with the letter tiles from that popular board game sort of falling in a random way to spell out the 400-odd pages of The God Delusion, to talk about the meaning in the book would be ludicrous. There would be no meaning. It would just be an accidental collection of alphabetic letters. Now, here's the thing. Many of you have probably worked out already that just as that illustration there applies to books, something similar has to apply to life, right? If the universe, if our lives, if our existence has an author, well, now we can ask about meaning. But if we are nothing more than, to use Bertrand Russell's words, a random collocation of atoms, then to ask about the meaning of life, or to claim grandly that we found the meaning of life, is ludicrous. It is, pardon the pun, meaningless. If there is no God, there is no author, and there is no purpose. You simply can't avoid that problem. So where does all of this get us? Well, a few years ago, an American psychologist called Roy Baumeister wrote a very helpful little book, and his book was called Meanings of Life. And in his book, Roy argues, through the sort of lens of psychology, that to answer the question, what's the meaning of life, which he admits is a question everybody asks, and he's not a religious person, as far as I know from reading his book. He says to answer that question, what's the meaning of life, there are actually 4 questions that you need to answer first. It's such a big question, you need to break it down. And the 4 questions you need to answer are these. You need to answer the question of identity. Who am I? You need to answer the question of value. What am I worth? What's my value? You need to answer the question of purpose, kind of why am I here? And then you need to answer the question of agency. Can I make a difference? Can I get to the end of my life and look back and go, if I hadn't been born, if my life had not been lived, the world would have been significantly different. And it's interesting how many movies and books and TV shows and pieces of art and so forth play with these themes. I think he's right. I think these are profound questions that feed into this much bigger question, what's the meaning of life? And I think every belief system, every religion, every worldview has to grapple with these 4 questions. You can't really avoid them. And that's true for atheism. You can't really avoid them as an atheist. But here's the thing. I think atheism, I think the view of reality that there is no God, fails to, in fact, can't answer these 4 questions, and therefore cannot answer the much bigger question of whether life itself has meaning. Let me show you how that fails, and then I'll show you how Christianity takes a very different perception, a very different approach to those questions. Let's start with the question of identity for a moment. If atheism is true, who are we? Who are we as human beings? If atheism is true, well, many atheist thinkers are very honest about this. Richard Dawkins, perhaps the world's best-known atheist, who I mentioned to you a moment ago, he's addressed this question in one of his books. He answers the question this way. He says, we are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules of DNA known as genes. In other words, you are a lumbering biological robot. You feeling positive about yourself this evening? Feeling affirmed? Well, if you still are, we can deal with that, because Richard has a friend called Lawrence Krauss, who's a physicist, another very well-known atheist. And Lawrence, in a recent interview, he went a bit further than his friend Richard. He said, we are a 1% bit of pollution within the universe. We are completely insignificant. And there we are. Any of you who are feeling affirmed this evening, I hope now you have got your therapist on speed dial. Pretty bleak stuff. We are lumbering biological robots. We are cosmic detritus of no value, no worth. Pretty bleak. But in one sense, I respect what they're saying. Because if atheism is true, if we live in a godless, materialistic universe, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that they're right. But if they are, atheism cannot answer the identity question in any meaningful way. Well, a similar problem occurs with the value question. How might we answer the value question? How might we assess the value of a life? If atheism is true and there is no God, how do we work out the value of each one of you this evening? Well, I guess if we were going to try and do that, we could take a number of approaches. Perhaps I would take a scientific approach. Perhaps if I was a chemist, I might grab Bill Smith here from the front row, clobber him over the head, drag him off to my secret laboratory buried deep beneath this part of Norcross. And there, in my secret chemistry laboratory, I have a giant glass test tube. And I'll stuff Bill into that test tube, boil him up to his constituent parts, so much potassium, so much iron, so much fat, and so forth. And then we can take his chemicals and we can stick them on eBay, and we'll see what somebody will bid us for the parts formerly known as Bill Smith. And I'm guessing about $4.97. That's about a couple of million Canadian at the moment. And, well, we're laughing, but of course we know that's not serious. You don't seriously value a human being in terms of the parts they're made from. Well, what other approach might we take? Maybe if we were economists, we might look at what you earn, for example. We might decide how much you're worth, what your production capacity is, and value you that way. But again, most people would think that's a horrific way to value a human being. If we were a sociologist, maybe we'd look at your value, how much the community value you. We could count how many friends you have. both the real friends and the pretend ones that you accumulate on Facebook to convince yourself that you're popular. All of those things. But again, we laugh at that and go, that doesn't work. We know that you don't value somebody based upon their parts, their production, their social networks, those kind of things. But those are really the only kind of routes we're going to have to go if we live in a godless universe. The one route not open to you is to say that human beings have any form of intrinsic value. Because why? You are just a collection of atoms. And again, atheism fails, I think, to answer the value question significantly. Well, what about the third question that Roy Baumeister, the psychologist, said we need to address? The question of purpose. Well, atheism can say nothing here at all, quite frankly. If atheism is true, if we live in a godless universe, you simply are. You're simply the result of time plus chance plus natural selection, and there's no reason that you're here, you simply are. And in fact, asking if your life has purpose is rather like walking out of the school this evening, seeing a small pile of litter that's been blown by the wind to the side of the road, and asking the question, what's the purpose of that pile of garbage? The answer is it has no purpose, it's just blown there by the wind. I mean, you could perhaps lie on it for a bed if you were desperate. You could perhaps spray paint it pink and use it as a modern contemporary art installation, but those aren't the purposes of that pile of garbage the wind has blown there. They're uses that you've assigned to it from outside. In and of itself, it has no purpose. And the same goes for us as human beings. Now, interestingly, I wonder if you've ever noticed that it's purpose that enables you to decide whether something is good or bad. I don't know if you've ever noticed that connection. For example, if I was to come to one of you after this evening and talking in the lobby perhaps, and I start grumbling about the jeweller from whom I bought my watch in Toronto, and I say, yeah, you know, the local jewellery store, they ripped me off, they're criminals, because they sold me a bad watch. And you say, what do you mean they sold you a bad watch? Well, I said, you know, last night before I flew down from Toronto to Atlanta, I was putting in that set of shelves my wife's been asking me to put in for the last 3 years, and I was hammering in nails with my watch, and my watch broke. It's a bad watch. I suspect you'd say two things. Number one, would you like the number of a good therapist here in Norcross? Number two, you'd probably gently put your arm around me and go, do you know, beating in nails is not the purpose of a watch. It's not the purpose of a watch. The purpose of a watch is telling the time. And we determine whether a watch is a good watch or not by how successfully it does that. It tells the time well, it's a good watch. It tells the time badly, it's a bad watch. Well then, what about human beings? I want to argue it's exactly the same. Unless you know the purpose of a human life, you can't answer the question, is that life well lived? You can't answer the question of whether something is good or bad unless you know what your purpose is. And of course, atheism can't answer that question. And in failing to answer it, gets into all kinds of other sticky hot water as well. That's mixing metaphors. Can you have sticky hot water? Possibly. There we go. Moving rapidly on then, one last question atheism fails to answer, and then we'll take a look at Christianity for a few moments. What about the question of agency? Can we make a difference in life? Well, again, I have to be really direct and really honest and say if atheism is true and we live in a godless universe, the answer to that question is a profound and resounding no. One of my favourite writers, once was actually a few years ago, when I was reading a bit more of him, was a gentleman called Leo Tolstoy, a Russian writer, famous for writing the novel War and Peace, which perhaps some of you may have had to read at high school. It's about 17 miles long and takes 30 years to read, and very sort of grim and dire like Russian novels are. And he was a very famous novelist. He made lots of money, he was very famous and influential in his 30s, and life was going well. But then in his 50s, Leo Tolstoy had a massive kind of midlife crisis, sparked by when he stumbled across a little question that his atheism couldn't answer. He was an atheist at this point, and he came across a question that shook him to his core. In his autobiography, he describes that experience. Let me read to you from his autobiography. He says, "This is, or was, a question without an answer to which one cannot live, as I had found by experience. It was, what will come of what I am doing today or shall do tomorrow? Differently expressed, the question is this: why should I live? Why wish for anything or do anything? It could also be expressed thus: is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy?" In other words, Tolstoy had worked out if atheism is true, nothing you do makes any difference. You will die, your children will die, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren will die, the human race will die, the sun will expand and swallow the earth, etc., etc., etc. Everything dies, everything rots, everything burns, everything comes to an end, and so why bother doing anything at all? That was the question that occurred to him, and he struggled to answer it profoundly. Or to put it in perhaps more pictorial terms, for those of you who prefer illustrations, think of it this way. Imagine that you find yourself standing on the deck of the Titanic as it's about to slip beneath the icy Atlantic waters. Almost everybody else has gone. Even Leonardo DiCaprio has sunk beneath the waves. And it is just you and one other fellow passenger standing on the deck as the boat is about to slip beneath the waves. And you look at your fellow passenger and a thought occurs to you. Well, you think to yourself, I could hug my fellow passenger, or I could punch him in the face and steal his wallet. But here's the thing. What difference does it make? Either way, you are going to be sleeping with the fishes that evening. And that's the problem that rattled Leo Tolstoy, and that's the problem for atheism. Why do anything? Because the end is exactly the same. It's bleakness and despair all the way down. And so atheism fails profoundly to answer all of those questions that you need to answer if you're going to answer the meaning of life question. You are simply cosmic scum, in the words of Lawrence Krauss. You have no value. Nothing you do makes any difference. You have no purpose, and so and on and on and on it goes. In fact, faced with this grim reality, the French atheist philosopher Albert Camus once remarked this. He said, the only true philosophical problem really facing the atheist is this one. Why not suicide? Again, profoundly tragic question. I say this not to be triumphalistic. I say this out of deep compassion and care for friends who found themselves reflecting on these things. Well now, is this the best we can do? Are we kind of stuck in this position, or is there an alternative way out? Well, it's interesting. By background, by initial training, before I got into the area that was my PhD, I was in computer science. I was a scientist. And science is interesting. It's interesting to reflect on the scientific method. How do we uncover truth in the sciences? In chemistry, we set fire to things and blow things up. But in most of the sciences, we uncover truth by inference to the best explanation of the facts. The way that science works is we look at the facts and the data that we have, and then we look at the range of theories we have to explain the data, and we try and explain the data on the basis of our theories. That's the way that most science these days is done. Well, here's the interesting thing. If the theory that you have fails to account for half the data, or you have to throw half the data away, or bury half the facts in a drawer, there is probably something wrong with your theory. Alternatively, if the theory that you have leads you to come up with such incredibly bizarre, unlivable, frankly weird explanations of the facts that are left on the table, again, I suggest something odd is going on and you need to rethink your theory. And I say that simply to point out this. If the conclusion, if the hypothesis, if the theory that there is no God leads to utterly bizarre conclusions, if it leads you to reject meaning, if it leads you to conclude there's no such thing as good and evil, that there's no purpose, that life is absurd, just take seriously the idea of suicide as a possibility, maybe there is something very wrong with your starting point, with your hypothesis, and you need to think again. Because for me, the most powerful explanation of a belief system, or test rather, a belief system or a worldview, is can you live it out in reality? Can you take what you believe and live it out in your everyday life with your friends and your neighbours and your community, and does it actually work? Well now, atheism doesn't. But there is a different perspective. There's a remarkably different perspective on these questions that I've talked about this evening. This whole question, what is the meaning of life, is one that the Bible addresses in a number of places. Let me read to you a few verses from the beginning of John's Gospel, the fourth of the four biographies of Jesus found in the New Testament. And I want to show you how this begins to give us a very interesting counter perspective on this question, can life have meaning? Let me read you this passage. For many of you, it may be quite well known. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. The Logos took on flesh and dwelt amongst us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, the interesting thing about that passage in John's Gospel, the Greek word logos that I left untranslated there in most New Testament and most English translations of the Bible, that's translated something like the word. But the Greek word logos was actually a word that was very well known in first century classical Greek literature. It was the word that the philosophers used to denote the meaning of life. See, Greek philosophers had been debating the question, does life have meaning, since time immemorial. It's one of the oldest questions of all. And by the time of Jesus, in the beginning of the first century AD, Greek philosophy had largely divided into two camps. On the one side, you had a group of guys called the Stoics. They believed that there was a meaning to life, but you could never, ever find it out. So the best you could do was kind of grin and bear the grim reality of life. I like to think of them as proto-British, actually, and that kind of sort of stour pessimism, really. Now, on the other hand, we have the Epicureans on the other side of the screen. They thought there was no meaning to life. It wasn't merely you couldn't find it, there was no meaning to life. So the best way to deal with life was eat, drink, merry, and party, for tomorrow we die and nothing matters. Sounds a bit familiar, right? Sounds a bit like 21st century culture in many ways. Well, into that raging debate between these two philosophical camps that was kind of very, very well known across the ancient world, into this raging debate, the Bible says something deeply radical. It borrows the term from philosophy, logos, the meaning of life, and says, you know what? There is a meaning to life. There is a logos. And you know what? The meaning of life, says the Bible, is not an idea. The meaning of life is not a concept, not a doctrine, not a philosophical system, nor is the meaning of life a sort of self-help book from that slightly strange New Age section at the back of chapters where it's best to go with a friend and a flashlight. The meaning of life is none of those things. No, the meaning of life, says the Bible, radically and counterculturally, the meaning of life is not an idea. The meaning of life is a person, Jesus Christ. And the meaning of life, the purpose of life, is to know him. So the Bible stands starkly opposed to atheism and says, you know what, we don't live in a meaningless world. We don't live in a purposeless world. We live in a world with a purpose. We live in a world with a direction and with a designer and with an author. And that designer, that author, is the God who didn't just make that world, but stepped into it in the person of Jesus and practically demonstrated my value and your value when Jesus gave up his life on the cross to deal with our brokenness and our rebellion and our injustices and our alienation. And I passionately believe that Christianity answers those four questions that you need to address in order to answer the meaning of life question far more profoundly than any other religion or belief system, not least atheism, which fails to get off the starting blocks entirely. Let me show you very quickly, as we begin to bring this in towards a close, what Christianity has to say to these four questions, beginning with identity. Christianity says, you are not a cosmic accident. You are not a lumbering biological robot or scum on the surface of the cosmic pond, but rather that you were created and shaped and designed by a creator God who loves you and knows you personally. That's what our identity is. What about our value? What does Christianity say to the whole question of value? Well, it's interesting. If you read any economic theory, in economic theory, value is conferred by what someone is prepared to pay. Objects don't have inherent value. So, for example, on the lectern here, I have my iPad. I value my iPad greatly. I paid $600 for that gadget, largely because the ability to play Candy Crush Saga while sitting in the washroom is really useful. It's a productivity tool. However, if I was to take my iPad to a desert island with no power and no cell phone signal and no Wi-Fi, none of those things, what would its value be? Well, probably nobody would pay me anything for it. It would be pretty useless. It might make a nice chopping board for coconuts or something, but it wouldn't have a lot of value because no one will be prepared to pay me anything. Well, if value is conferred by what someone is prepared to pay, what does it mean to speak of the value of a human life? Well, interestingly, Christianity says something very profound there. Christianity says that God was prepared to pay not just a high price, but the infinite price, the ultimate price for each one of us, because he paid the price of Jesus Christ, his Son, who gave up his life willingly on the cross to pay the debt that we could never repay to God for the injustices and brokenness that characterize our lives and our default state. Why do we have value as human beings for Christianity? Because of what God was prepared to pay. That's a profound answer to the value question that you will not find anything even remotely approaching that in any other worldview. Certainly not atheism, certainly not Islam, interestingly either, or many other religious worldviews. Well, penultimately, turning to purpose, what does Christianity have to say here? Well, Christianity says there is an author, there is a God who made the world, who designed this world, and there's a purpose and a meaning and built into it. What is the purpose of life, says the Bible? It's very simple, actually. On one hand, and very complex on the other. It's to know God and enjoy him forever. That's one of those statements that's really easy to say, but unpacking it and living it out and discovering how deep it goes takes a lifetime and indeed an eternity of following God. But that's the purpose that God has woven into reality. And then lastly, what about the agency question? What about this need, this deep need we have as human beings to feel that our lives made a difference? Nobody wants to get to the end of their life and look back and go, you know what, if I'd never been born, it would never have made a single difference. What does Christianity have to say to that question? Well, one of my favourite writers, probably known to many of you here in this hall this evening, is the English writer J.R.R. Tolkien, famous for Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and all those kind of things. Well, not many people are aware that Tolkien also wrote short stories. And one of the short stories he wrote that did quite well, he wrote a short story called Leaf by Niggle. And in the story of Leaf by Niggle, Tolkien tells the story of a struggling artist, a painter called Niggle. And Niggle has this life's ambition. He wants to paint this incredibly beautiful picture. And in his mind's eye, he's got it all mapped out. He wants to paint this picture of a tree standing on the edge of a forest, and behind the forest there's a kind of river valley and then mountains in the background. It's going to be this beautiful landscape. He's got it all in his mind, and he paints and he paints and he paints every day. Problem is, though, Niggle is pedantic, and he's a perfectionist. And he's such a perfectionist that he can never finish more than one leaf on one tree. In fact, he spends day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, working and obsessing on just trying to get this one leaf right. He never gets to the tree or the forest or anything else. And then, sadly, he catches an illness in the story, and he dies. His canvas left unfinished, apart from this one beautiful leaf in the middle of it. And his friends, actually, in the story, come along and cut the bit of canvas out with the leaf on it, and they hang it in the town art gallery, and they title it Leaf by Niggle, which is where the story title comes from. Well, the story doesn't end there, because in Tolkien's story, Niggle goes to heaven, and he arrives in heaven, and as he approaches the edge of the heavenly country, the heavenly city, he sees, by the side of the road, a tree growing. And on that tree is hanging a leaf. Not just any leaf, but his leaf, that he spent his life working. But it's not there hanging on its own, it's part of something much bigger. It's part of a tree and a forest and a much, much bigger scene. And what Tolkien was saying through that story was, you know what, we are all like Niggle. As human beings, we spend our lives chasing after the most incredibly foolish things. We pursue career and money and success and family and maybe things that are okay in themselves, but things, if you make them ultimate, are going to let you down desperately. And we pursue them and we chase after them, and actually, ultimately, they're going to make no difference at all. Unless what you spend your life pursuing and pouring your energies into can become caught up in and become part of God's bigger purposes. And if that happens, then your strivings truly can outlive you. Your life can make a real difference. And your life's work is revealed to be part of something much, much, much bigger. The kingdom that God is building for eternity. I opened this talk this evening with the story of my friend and the hockey player on the plane. And the hockey player, the sports star, who was struggling with despair and that whole question of where do you go after you've lived your life at the top, when the only way in a worldly kind of approach really is down. Where do you go? Well, I want to tell you a little bit more about how that story kind of came to an end. After the hockey player had sort of burst into tears and, sort of told what a tragedy his life was, My friend was able to share with him, actually give him a copy of a book she'd just finished reading that she happened to have in her purse by sort of coincidence, or for some of us who don't believe in such things as coincidence, but there was the book in the purse. And it was an interesting book. The book that she'd just finished reading, and she actually gave to the sports star that evening, is a book called Moonwalker. And it's a fascinating book. Not very well known. I'd be surprised if any of you here have read it, but you can get it on Amazon if what I tell you about tonight about the story intrigues you. Moonwalker is written by a gentleman called Charlie Duke. And Charlie's got an interesting story. He grew up in a small farming community in rural North Carolina. And as a young boy, he was always fascinated by flying. And in fact, the farm next to him, the farmer owned a crop duster plane. So he'd learned to fly by the age of 14. Well, the next ambition he had after learning to fly was he wanted to get into the United States Air Force, into the USAF. So he applied. And he got accepted. He got accepted into the Air Force. He did very well. Next thing he wanted to do was he wanted to fly fast jets. He loved speed. And so he wanted to become a fighter pilot. And he applied for that program, and he was successful. He became accepted as a fighter pilot. Well, fighter jets were not enough. He wanted more speed and more power and more excitement. So he trained as a test pilot and applied for the test pilot program. And he got accepted and began to fly these incredibly, stupidly fast, dangerous things, had a lot of fun. But it was not enough. He wanted to go higher and higher and higher. So he did what any man on a way up would do. He applied to NASA, to the astronaut program, because he thought that's the next obvious step. He got accepted by NASA, was trained as an astronaut, and then his ambition, his burning desire, was to get selected for one of the Apollo moon missions, which were going on at this point in time. And again, his dream came true. And in 1972, he became the 10th person to walk on the moon. When he flew on the Apollo 16 mission, there he is on the moon. Now, in his autobiography, Charlie Duke tells the story of what happened next. He tells the story of coming back to Earth after walking on the moon. And he came back to a hero's welcome, a ticker tape parade, paparazzi taking photographs, media, a hero's welcome, media scrum, even an audience with the president. And then he describes waking up the next day and reality hitting him with a crushing blow. Because the question then arose, where do you go after you've been to the moon? You literally can't go any higher. He has been as high as it is possible for any man or woman to go. And that crushing, weighing down sense that there was nothing more worth living for, nothing higher to achieve, almost tore his life and his marriage apart. Finally, in his book, Charlie describes how he heard the message of the gospel and the message of Jesus Christ explained to him, and he powerfully encountered Jesus and discovered at last the only thing worth living for that really was bigger than he was. Even the moon wasn't big enough. He'd finally discovered the painful hard way that he needed something to root his identity that wasn't career, that wasn't performance, that wasn't fame, that wasn't success. That was the only way to find peace. And at the end of his book, he writes these words. He says, I used to say that I could live 10,000 years and never have an experience like as thrilling as walking on the moon. But the excitement and satisfaction of that walk does not begin to compare with my walk with Jesus, a walk that lasts forever. You see, true peace, ladies and gentlemen, comes only through discovering life's purpose, encountering Jesus for yourself. That is life's true purpose. And so my question to each one of you as I just bring this to an end, and we're going to transition shortly into a Q&A time, my question to each one of you is simply this: have you really experienced that for yourself? Have you really encountered life's true purpose in Jesus? Or are you still pursuing meaning and identity in all kinds of crazy places, in career or success or money or family, things that aren't wrong in themselves, but if you try and make them ultimate things, will let them down? I discovered this myself as a young man in my 20s, when I'd had academic success and business success, and I thought that way lay happiness. And in my case, I burnt myself out and drove myself into near clinical depression through trying to chase meaning and purpose in those things. And it was only when my family doctor looked at the whirlwind life I was living and asked me this question, son, what are you trying to prove and to whom, that I suddenly realized where I'd gone badly wrong. Have you discovered that same lesson this evening? Because that new life in Christ, that purpose to life, life's true purpose, begins so simply begins with 3 words. Sorry, God. Sorry. I'm sorry that I've tried to live my life pursuing meaning in all the wrong places. I'm sorry. Thank you that there is real meaning to be found. Thank you for coming in the person of Jesus to die on that cross, to deal with my alienation and my wrongdoing and my injustice, that I might know you, know life's true purpose. And please come into my life, fill me afresh, and connect me with you, that I might know that peace and that purpose and that meaning. And it's my hope and my prayer that if you are sitting here this evening, not sure about any of these things, or having not yet discovered them from yourself, that you may soon do so, maybe even tonight. Thank you for listening so patiently. Good.